Hey guys, it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10 here on the Nitsahone Magic channel. I'm Nitsahone, and this week I'm doing something a little bit different than I've done so far in the series. Instead of talking about a list of cards as I've done in the first 6 or so MTG Top 10s, this week I'm going to do a different kind of list. This time, my top 10 tips for drafting of any format. In the wake of my MTG limited review for Shadows over Innistrad, I had several people ask me about more broad drafting tips than just talking about, the best commons and uncommons, which that stuff's helpful, but I decided to do a video that's, a little bit more for beginners about the best things to do during a draft, best things to know about drafting any format, and that's what this list is. Before I get started, if you're enjoying these MTG Top 10s, don't forget to like it because it helps me know what I should keep doing. So onward from here, we have number 10, and my first tip is that you aren't playing constructed. And this may seem obvious, but I've seen this show up as a problem for people, and I know that in my early days of playing limited, this was a big one of my roadblocks as well. Basically, you need to try to disconnect your mind from any idea about whether a card sees play in constructed, or whether it would even be good in constructed. There are several instances of cards that never saw play in constructed that are completely ridiculous in limited. And there's also examples of cards that are great in constructed, like, for example, Zergo Bellstriker, who isn't that great in limited. I'm not saying you shouldn't play Zergo Bellstriker, just don't take him highly because you know he's good in constructed. In limited, a 1-mana 2/2 who can't block most creatures gets to be pretty bad by the later portion of the game, and that's what makes him bad in limited. He's good in constructed because if you're wanting to curve out, which most red aggro burn decks want to do, you have enough redundancy in your deck that Zergo, along with your other 1-drops, is very good because it makes sure you curve out. That's a little harder to pull off in limited, so that's one reason why it's not so good. Similar card is Collected Company. Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't play this in limited, but it's not, it's the best card in standard right now, or one of them anyway, and it's not especially great in limited. You have to make sure you build a deck around it that has enough creatures that you can hit with Collected Company. And you also, it's nice to get the 2 cards if you can, but you're not always going to with Collected Company just because of the way limited formats work. And so that's just a couple examples of cards that are good in constructed, but you shouldn't overvalue in limited because you know they're good in constructed. These are cards that, yeah, sure, you should probably take somewhere near the middle of a pack if you're in those colors, but don't take them early. Similarly, cards that are bad in constructed, like Sentinel of the Eternal Watch, who's way too expensive and way too easy to remove in constructed, was one of the best cards, rare or uncommon, in Magic Origins Limited. As a 6-mana 4/6 with Vigilance, it can do it offense and defense, and on top of that, it taps down your opponent's best creature every turn. Again, it's clunky for constructed, but amazing in limited, and similarly, Temur Sabertooth was one of the best uncommons in Fate Reforged, but it never really made it into constructed. So basically what I'm saying here is don't let your impressions of constructed affect how you evaluate cards when you're drafting. Think about the card in the format itself. Don't think about how good it is in constructed. So that's what I have for number 10. At number 9, I have don't forget your sideboard. This has numerous implications. First, I mean to apply it to the actual drafting portion of an event. If you have a choice between picking up a marginally playable card for your main deck and a superb card for your sideboard, let's say Canopy Gorger versus Plummet, for example, you should probably take Plummet. Obviously, these weren't actually in the same set, but there are similar mediocre commons that you take late that you're like, well, maybe I'll play it if I'm short on playables. But it's better to take something like Plummet, which is a very strong sideboard card. A card like Plummet, which is a very efficient removal spell for one specific kind of creature, those with flying, is a great sideboard card because you're almost always going to end up siding it in. Even if you're just playing 3 rounds of draft, you'll probably side it in at least once. And over time, making sure you take these good sideboard cards will, have a minor impact on how much you win, but over time that'll really add up. Similarly, though, I'm also talking about sort of less obvious sideboard things. Something like Seagraft Scob in Avacyn Restored, in Shadows over Innistrad, is a 2-mana 1/3. It's a card you'll play sometimes in the limited format of Shadows over Innistrad, but a lot of times you're just going to end up picking up extras of these who maybe you can side in. But it's actually a pretty good sideboard card. It's not in an obvious way like Destroy Target Creature with Flying is for Plummet, but it is in the sense that if your opponent has a lot of 2/1s or 3/1s or anything like that, Seagraft Scott becomes a very good blocker. Even against a lot of 2/2s, he can hold the ground pretty well. And so he's the kind of card you want to side in. Similarly, Drownyard Explorers is a solid common one you'll play a lot of, but against certain aggressive decks, you'll probably play, usually you probably don't want more than 2 of these, but they're going to be matchups against more aggressive decks where they have lots of, X2s that you really want to bring in your Drowned Explorers against because it can block them very effectively. So it's good to remember less obvious sideboard things, like just bringing in more creatures who can block more effectively against a more aggressive deck who's filled with low toughness creatures, as well as remembering to just take certain cards in draft, like, say, taking Plummet over a mediocre 6-drop that you're probably not going to play anyway, whereas Plummet will at least probably make it into your deck for at least one game. All right, so from number 9, we go to number 8, which is don't let a card's rarity affect your judgment. This is something I think that we're all guilty of at times. If we don't make sure to compare certain high-rarity cards against low-rarity cards, we can end up overrating them. This happened for me personally most recently when thinking about the card Oath of Gideon. I have Call of the Scions here too for obvious reasons, which I'll explain in a moment. Oath of Gideon is rare. It's a cool legendary equipment. It has one of the major characters in the storyline on it, so it's a cool card. I mean, I never thought it was amazing, but I thought it was more playable than it was. And then in one draft, I saw also Call the Scions, and I thought about how similar the two cards were. Call the Scions is a borderline playable card, that I knew. Is a common, so it didn't trick me, and only good with some very specific sacrifice or ramp synergies, and that was clear to me when I evaluated Call the Scions. What wasn't clear is that Oath of Gideon is basically the same thing despite being rare. It's pretty meh in a deck that didn't have ally or go wide synergies. But I found myself going into Oath of the Gatewatch drafts thinking it was a better card than that, thinking it was, at least pickable in the middle of a pack, but most of the time it's not. Most of the time you don't really want Oath of Gideon unless you've assembled some synergies for it. This is just one example. There's several other examples throughout the history of the game where a card being rare led to people over-evaluating it. This is just the most recent one, for me anyway, where I made that mistake, but eventually figured it out. So I hope this mistake from my own recent past can help you learn something as well. So number 7 is another one from the recent past, and it's don't completely avoid colors because you heard they were bad. This is a problem that I think a lot of intermediate and even some advanced players can be guilty of sometimes. Once various pros come out and talk about a format, and we're given the chance to read what they have to say about them, people start drafting differently. In almost every format, there is a worst color. It is just impossible for every color to be balanced in a format, so this is basically always true. And once the pros have selected their worst color, people start avoiding it like the plague in a lot of cases. This was the most true for me when I was drafting Triple Battle for Zendikar, where I ended up seeing multiple copies of Brood Monitor and Tajuru Warcaller in drafts because people just decided to stop drafting green altogether. I'm not here to tell you that green wasn't the worst color in the format. It most definitely was. But even a bad color can be competitive if no one else is drafting it. People say draft is self-correcting, and that's what they mean. If people stop drafting the worst color altogether, you're still going to get all the best cards in that color, which is good compared to the competition, the competitiveness there is for the other colors and so your opponents aren't going to get as many high-quality cards. People were zealously avoiding green, and so you end up seeing really great uncommons, multiples like Brood Monitor or Tajuru Warcaller. Basically, in the early goings of a draft, it is fine to think, well, X color is bad as a tiebreaker, in this case green, when deciding what to pick, but don't ignore huge signs that a color is open, like high-quality removal or uncommons in that particular color. So in Triple Battle for Zendikar, that would be seeing like a Brood Monitor 8th pick. That probably means you should get into green because you're going to get all the good green cards because Brood Monitor is ridiculous. So that's my number 7. At number 6, I have learn every instant speed common and uncommon in a format. This is important because you should know every potential outcome of any play you make. I have one example of it here. For example, if you want to play Rabid Bite to kill your opponent's creature, but they have multiple cards in their hand and have one RR, one colorless, generic, I guess, and 2 red mana up, you should be aware that Fiery Temper is a possibility if your opponent has 3 toughness or less. Moreover, if they have a discard outlet and they only have 1 red mana up, you should still be thinking about it. And so if you want to be casting Rabid Bite, for example, which is the card on the left here, you should be aware of what your opponent could be capable of with the mana that they have up. So if you're using Rabid Bite to have your creature with 3 or less toughness fight something, and your opponent has 3 mana or even 1 mana up, and they're in red, Fiery Temper is a real possibility. I'm not saying you should always avoid casting Rabid Bite in those situations. I think you should most of the time. Sometimes you don't have a choice, though. Sometimes you have to go for it. But I'm saying be aware of whatever the biggest blowout possible is. So knowing that Fiery Temper is a common means that your opponent could have a couple copies of it. It means a lot were open in the draft, so you need to be ready for it. This is also true of combat tricks. When you're using your own combat tricks, be aware of what kind of instant speed shenanigans your opponent can perform on you that could blow you out, the same way they could blow out a Rabid Bite if they use removal in response. And also, when your opponent's has the potential to use combat tricks, think about what combat trick they might be playing if they're attacking with their 2/2 into their 4/4. Be ready for that sort of outcome. And basically, the goal you want to get to is when you can just look at your opponent's board, see how much mana they have up, see how many cards they have in their hand, and think about what the possibilities are. And once you can do that and think about what the worst-case scenarios are, you're in the best shape you can be. And this helps you play much better because basically it avoids you getting 2-for-1 as often, and it also allows you to 2-for-1 your opponent a little more often. It's worth noting that also knowing the rare instant speed things is worthwhile. But it's also, you're going to see a lot less of rare instant speed cards. It is worth noting in Shadows over Innistrad, which is when I'm making this video, is when Shadows over Innistrad is the format, that there are also tons of Madness cards that are basically secretly instant speed, even if they're sorceries or creatures or whatever, because if you can Madness them out, that's important. So keep an eye out also in Shadows over Innistrad for any sort of discard outlet and your opponent having mana up, because they could be doing a lot of things with that. So that's my number 6. At number 5, I have, sort of a cliche, an adage, practice makes perfect. It applies to a lot of things in life and also applies to Magic, and I think it applies perhaps the most to Limited. The only way you can get better at Magic is to keep playing more Magic, and the only way to get better at drafting is to keep on drafting, basically. The more experience you get in an individual format, the better you will understand its intricacies, and the more you understand the individual formats, the better you will get at evaluating cards that will appear in future sets. Basically, the more you draft, the better you're going to get, and this can even carry over to future formats. Basically, be like the clockwork grinder here and just keep grinding out drafts, and the more you do it, the better you'll get. Even if a particular draft doesn't go well, especially if it's in a new format, sometimes that can happen to us, think about what could have made it better. Think about if you overrated certain cards during your draft. Think about if you weren't thinking about, you weren't making the right plays, or your opponent, maybe your opponent just, drew really well and that's what beat you. But no matter what, you can learn from any draft, whether you lose or win. So that's what I have as number 5. At number 4, I have Money Draft. I know. This one goes against most of the rest of what I've talked about in this video, because the rest of my suggestions are geared towards helping you win. But this one is also geared towards helping you win, believe it or not, in the long run. Knowing what the value of cards are during a draft is important, and taking cards that have a high monetary value is also important. This isn't because I think you should be greedy and try to make money off of drafting, although if you can, good for you. It is because taking cards with high value help us be able to afford drafting more. And as I just mentioned in talking about practice makes perfect, the more money you get back from drafting, the more you're capable of continuing to draft even more. I will say this probably applies the most to Magic Online, where it is incredibly easy to sell off cards and cash them in to do another draft. But this also applies in real life as well, where you can, trade in your cards or win enough packs just to do another draft. Now, if you have an unlimited source of funds or you intend on keeping certain cards for Constructed, this tip may not be the best for you. But if you're someone who wants to get better at drafting and love drafting more than anything else in Magic, money drafting is definitely a way that can make sure you continue to draft well. I have Tarmogoyf here because of the controversy, a year ago or so, where a pro took foil Tarmogoyf from Modern Masters first pick, and everyone lost their minds because Tarmogoyf isn't actually that good in Limited, but it's worth a lot of money in the Modern Masters set, and that's why people take it, because it can make sure you can draft even more and more. So money drafting, believe it or not, in the long run can help you get better at Magic, because it allows you to practice more and more, because your drafts cost you less money than they would have otherwise. So onwards, we go to number 3, which is prioritize removal. In basically every format, there are premium removal spells that are first pickable. High-quality, unconditional removal is something you should prioritize over almost everything except for the highest level bombs. This is because these cards can deal with anything that your opponent can throw at you, including your opponent's high-level bombs. Examples of this from recent past are Isolation Zone and Oblivion Strike, both 4 mana and deal with a creature, and that's a pretty impressive effect. And even though they're commons, removal like this is almost always going to be your best first pick in a pack, barring, again, a game-changing bomb of one kind or another. People need to make sure that they evaluate removal highly and don't overlook it in packs when they get excited about seeing a cool rare creature Because there's even most rare creatures I would let go and take Isolation Zone or Oblivion Strike instead. And I think that's something that people should try to do more often if they want to improve their drafting. Because if you don't have removal, it's pretty hard to do well in a draft, because if your opponent just sticks a big creature, you're usually in trouble. Sometimes you can have a very aggressive deck that needs very little removal, but you're not going to get there in most formats. And it's also worth noting that there's other removal that isn't completely unconditional, but is so efficient, like Dead Weight and Fiery Impulse, that it's still very highly pickable. These two cards can allow you to trade up for mana relatively frequently. You can pay 1 to kill creatures that cost 3-4 mana. Fiery Impulse can sometimes even do 3 damage. Both of these cards are strong, even though they're 1 mana and conditional removal, and that's because they are so efficient. They can deal with things so well. They're not quite as first pickable, but I do want to stress that these cards should be evaluated fairly highly in your pick order when you're thinking about a format. When you see Dead Weight or Fiery Pulse late in a pack too, that's a signal those colors are open because they're such strong cards. Just like Oblivion Strike or Isolation Zone, seeing them late would be as well. So that's what I have for number 3. Make sure you prioritize removal. I think it's one of the most important things for a new player to be aware of. So from there, we go to number 2, which is listen to signals. Forcing colors or an archetype is never a good idea, at least not if you are playing with the primary goal of winning. If you're looking to do some sort of kooky draft, by all means, force an archetype or a color. I do it myself near the end of formats when they start getting stale. But if you open up an amazing bomb, let's say, for example, Archangel Avacyn, who we see here, you should by all means attempt to stay white, so that you can play such an incredible card. However, if you stop seeing playable white cards early on in Pack 1, or even by the middle of Pack 1, and stop seeing them all together in Pack 2, unfortunately you probably need to abandon your Avacyn, especially because she's double white. You can't splash her well. If you can pick up Fixing to Splash her, then great, but don't try to force white as a primary color just because you have Avacyn, because sometimes things are just going to dry up for you. You're just not, other people are going to be in white as well, and you're just not going to get the colors you need. Avacyn's amazing and all, but if your deck is filled with mediocre playables to make it so you can play Avacyn easily in your deck, other mediocre white playables, your deck's not going to be very good, even with Avacyn. Maybe if you cast Avacyn in a game, you have a great chance of winning, but you're not going to get her every game. And so sometimes we have to sadly abandon our sweet mythic that we opened in Pack 1 in situations where we're just not seeing the right signals. If colors start to dry up, basically what my advice is here is you have to be ready to pivot away from it, and you have to be able to also read signals of what colors are open. I mentioned some of them already. If you see very high quality uncommons, especially removal, uncommons and commons, especially removal, you should probably think about pivoting into those colors. Take cards and take a flyer on whatever color that is and see if it's open. Because sometimes you're just, as I've said, you're just not going to get a chance to play in a color even though you opened a sweet mythic like Archangel Avacyn. So always be ready to pivot based on what you see, and your decks are going to be better than they would be if you just force a color. Most of the time. Sometimes, you can force a color and it works out, but it doesn't always. So on we go to number 1, which is think about what cards do for you at all stages of the game. This is something that applies to your evaluation of cards in a format. You have to think about how good a card is in any sort of situation in the game. Some of the ways of thinking about it are thinking about the early game, the mid game, and the late game, but I find it is usually best to think about things like whether a card is good when you're ahead, behind, or at parity in the same sort of state of the board your opponent is. The best cards are the ones that are good at all 3 phases of the game. Removal and bombs are the only things that usually fit this bill. A Region All-Star bit being good no matter what the state of the game is Linvala the Preserver. She's, of course, a mythic, so she's very strong, but she's just, I think, a very good example of what I mean when I say good at all stages of the game. She has effects that make it so that if you're behind your opponent in life or on board, she can fix that for you. Plus, if you're ahead, you just played a 5/5 flyer. So she helps you get ahead if you weren't, or get to parity if it wasn't at parity. And if you're at parity, she makes you win, basically. And if you're ahead, she makes you win as well. So cards like Linvala the Preserver that are good at every stage, which again includes removal, so it relates to one of my previous points, is important. One of the good litmus tests, I think, when thinking about evaluating a card in Limited is to say, if I were to top deck this card, in the late game, when I'm behind, how happy would I be? Or if I were at parity or ahead, how happy would I be? And if your answer is not very, it kind of takes us back to Zergo Bellstriker at the beginning, a 1-mana 2/2. You probably don't want to highly evaluate that card. And I think a good example of that from the most recent set is like Pick the Brain. Pick the Brain, I think, is probably most of the time not playable anyway, but I think it's a good example of a card like that is bad in most phases of the game. because if you top deck this late, you don't really want it. In the early game, you don't want to be spending a turn making your opponent discard something. Maybe pick the brain is solid in the mid game when you can get rid of your opponent's best spell, their big 6 or 7 drop. Maybe then it's good, but it's only one of the 3 situations. And if a card's only good in one of 3 situations, you probably don't want it. This applies the most, I think, to cards that don't affect the board, like Pick the Brain, because even if you top deck a 2-drop in the late game and you're at parity, it can help you get ahead a little bit. It can help you, protect yourself. And if you play it in the early game, you're curving out. So a card like that, even just like a 2-mana 2/2, is actually, solid at 2 points of the game, where a card like Pick the Brain isn't. So those are my 10 tips for succeeding in basically any limited format. Let me know what you think of them, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.